One moment, Tobruk was a symbol for determination and fighting spirit. The next moment, panzers and infantry cleared the streets and took the port with lightning speed. Not one, not two, but 3 separate battles were fought for Tobruk. Today, I am continuing my series called Historical Hell Let Loose, and today we're going to talk about the history behind the map Tobruk. I apologize to you all for taking so long to come out with episode 2. Life has gotten a little crazy, but definitely in a good way. I look forward to covering all of the maps in Hell Let Loose with you guys in the future. But for now, Tobruk. I'm going to be doing a fair amount of jumping around for this episode because in order to, do justice to Tobruk, there's a lot of things that happen in and around Tobruk. In June of 1940, Italy formally declared war on France and Britain and immediately set their sights on seizing the Suez Canal. Originally, an invasion of Egypt was planned for July of 1940, but the German cancellation of Operation Sea Lion and the intense summer heat delayed the start of the invasion, with small skirmishes along the Libyan-Egyptian border occurring in the time between. The Italian 10th Army, led by Italian Lieutenant General Mario Berti, made their move on September 9th, 1940. Supported by Squadra 5 of the Regia Aeronautica, aka the Royal Italian Air Force, 10th Army advanced along the Egyptian coast slowly but steadily. Britain offered what resistance they could, but being outnumbered roughly 150,000 to 36,000, delaying actions and retreating to different defensive positions was about all they could muster. By September 16th, 1940, the Italians had taken Sidi Barrani, a port city looking out to the Mediterranean Sea. Italian orders were to halt and hold this area, while the engineers could construct the Victory Road, a supply route meant to feed the army as it pushed on to the Suez Canal and the rest of Egypt. Little did they know that Britain and her allies still had a card to play. Italy planned on resuming their advance by mid-December, but the British Western Desert Force, led by British General Archibald Wavell, will launch an operation so devastating that it would put the Italian forces in North Africa in jeopardy. At 5 a.m. on December 9th, 1940, Operation Compass was launched. Originally meant to be a 5-day raid, the sudden British offensive was a complete surprise to the Italians, quickly regaining all the lost Egyptian territory and making advances into Italian Libya. On January 6, 1941, the first actual Battle of Tobruk took place. The British 13th Corps surrounded Tobruk, besieging the Italian 22nd Corps. On January 21st, British artillery bombarded the city, and a breach was made in the Italian perimeter. Italian forces defending the city would go on to surrender the next day, with 25,000 men being taken prisoner. Operation Compass would finally cease on February 8, 1941, with the British pushing the Italians all the way through Cyrenaica and halting before El Gala. The numbers were astonishing. Italian losses were colossal, with 5,500 men killed, 10,000 wounded, and a whopping 133,298 men taken prisoner, along with 420 tanks, 564 aircraft, and 845 guns. British losses were much fewer, with 500 dead, 1,373 wounded, and 55 missing. This defeat was so immense that Italy would plead for assistance from her ally, Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler agreed to give the Italians aid and issued Directive 22, establishing the German Africa Corps and placing Erwin Rommel in command. The stage was set for one of the most famous commanders in World War II to earn his reputation as the Desert Fox. Erwin Rommel was a master of tactics. Upon reaching El Agheila, he understood the ground between his position and Benghazi was excellent tank country. However, he wasn't actually in command of all Axis troops in North Africa. Newly appointed Italian Governor-General of Libya, Italo Garibaldi, was. Garibaldi, along with the German High Command, did not want to take an offensive action. Thus, official orders were to defend Tripoli, albeit aggressively. Erwin Rommel disregarded the order, and on March 24, 1941, he launched Operation Sonnenblume, a decisive strike to reclaim Cyrenaica from British control and secure positioning for the continuation of the invasion of Egypt. Rommel's advance was swift. By April 8th, German forces reached Tobruk, with the port city being put under siege by April 10th. About 27,000 British and Australian forces held the city, and the second battle that would take place here would last quite a while. The siege of Tobruk would become symbolic for Australian and British military histories. Able to get small amounts of supplies through the port, these men were completely cut off from the rest of North Africa. German and Italian forces did try to assault the city on the night of April 30th, and for the next 4 days, German and Italian forces would make a 3-mile breach, but only about 2 miles deep, not the deliberate capture that Rommel was anticipating. German and Italian casualties in the assault numbered about 1,150. British and Australian numbers are unknown. The rest of the siege would settle into raids and skirmishes. Months would go by, and the Rats of Tobruk, as they would come to be known, would hold firm. The British would go on to launch 3 relief operations. Operation Brevity, which is a limited operation meant to secure a jumping-off point to reoccupy Cyrenaica, launched on May 15, 1941. Halfaya Pass, Bir Wair, Musaid, and Fort Capuzzo were captured. German counterattacks retook most of the ground, with the operation almost being a wash. Operation Battle Axe was launched on June 15, 1941, but the attack was completely repulsed by Axis forces. By June 17th, the attack was called off, with General Archibald Wavell being sacked and General Claude Auchinleck taking command of Allied forces in North Africa. On November 18, 1941, the operation that would succeed in relieving Tobruk was launched, Operation Crusader. An outflanking move made by the British 8th Army surprised Rommel and the Africa Corps, forcing them to retreat back into Cyrenaica. By December 5th, Erwin Rommel was informed that his supply situation could not be improved. Since Axis forces were unable to take Tobruk, their supply lines reached almost 560 miles. With his supply situation and the determined advance by the British 8th Army, Rommel decided to abandon the siege of Tobruk and withdraw to Gazala. The beleaguered Australian and British troops that defended Tobruk would be relieved, and Tobruk would become famous for being a symbol of British and Australian resolve. Also to mention, Polish, New Zealand, and Czechoslovakian troops would also enter the ranks of the defenders, as reinforcements and supplies would be ferried into the port. Allied losses in the siege numbered 5,989 casualties. Axis losses were 12,296. For over 7 months, Allied troops would not break under the weight of Axis tenacity. Allied forces would push the German Africa Corps all the way back to El Agheila, where Erwin Rommel commenced Operation Sonnenblume almost a year earlier. The burden of supply shortages now swung to the British side. The Allied plan was to launch Operation Acrobat, a drive into Tripolitania. However, bolstered by reinforcement and supplies, Erwin Rommel would beat them to the punch. On January 21st, 1942, Operation Theseus was launched. The Afrika Korps smashed British forces in front of them, with Benghazi falling on the 28th and forcing the British back to Gazala by February 6th, once again threatening Tobruk. The front line would stabilize for the time being, but Tobruk would be a battlefield once again in the near future. On May 26, 1942, Rommel would attempt to outflank Gazala in what would be known as Operation Venezia. By June 13th, Allied forces would abandon the Gazala line, and by June 17th, Axis forces once again had Tobruk isolated. Although Tobruk held firm for a long time the year before, much of the city's barbed wire and minefields were stripped to reinforce the Gazala line, the same line that Allied forces abandoned days before. So Tobruk wasn't as strong structurally as it was the year before. Also, British command was divided on whether the port should be defended as the year prior, saying that reinforcements might be needed for Persia, Iraq, and Egypt itself. Still, Allied forces in the city numbered 35,000 British, Australian, Indian, and South African troops, who understood how hard the city was to take the last time around. Erwin Rommel had other plans. Instead of moving past the city and laying it under siege, he decided to launch a deliberate attack in order to seize the port city quickly. On June 20th, 1942, he would do just that. Rommel's plan was to attack the southeast perimeter of Tobruk, where he knew the ground was flatter and more suitable for tank operations. He gave the job to the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, along with a motorized detachment under the command of Erwin Meny. He incorporated a lot more air power than the previous attempt to take Tobruk, with Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica planes filling the skies. The air bombardment kicked off at 5:20 a.m. on June 20th, with the Luftwaffe flying 588 sorties and the Regia Aeronautica flying 177. The ground assault began at 7 a.m., with a breach being created by 7:45. By 8:30 a.m., German engineers had constructed crossings of anti-tank ditches. The German panzers rolled over and into the breach. The 4th Regiment of the 32nd Tank Brigade counterattacked the German panzer breach, but they were swept away in detail. By noon, Rommel had 113 panzers in the Tobruk perimeter. The 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions kept moving toward the town, met by the 7th Regiment of the 32nd Tank Brigade and an anti-tank artillery battery, who Rommel would praise for having extraordinary tenacity. These units, only delayed, would seem to be inevitable. By 6 p.m., German forces had reached the port, finding food, ammunition, fuel stores, and the port itself being damaged or destroyed by British engineers. At dusk, the German forces halted for the night, taking refuge in any captured buildings or strong points. They understood the next day would be momentous for the future of the Desert War. The man in charge of the Tobruk garrison was a South African general by the name of Hendrik Klopper. Klopper was not put into an easy situation. His orders were to attempt to break out the following night. The problems with this were that most of his troops that he had left were not motorized. Most of the trucks they did have were already captured by the enemy, and a lot of their fuel supply was either captured or destroyed. He did still have about 33,000 troops left that were not directly engaged the day before, so a defensive holdout to the west was considered. However, the garrison's main ammunition supply was also captured, so the troops that did still stand could only fight with the ammunition they had on their person or close by. Klopper was originally intent on holding his position and quote-unquote fight to the last man in the last round, but the morning of June 21st he changed his mind, concluding that the cost in additional casualties was too high to defend something that was already in enemy hands. Orders to surrender were issued, with a lot of units confused since they were not in much of a fight. German officers were invited to Klopper's headquarters to finalize details, with Klopper surrendering to Erwin Rommel himself at 9:40 a.m. Not all troops received the order, with some fighting on until the following day. Some even managed to escape all the way to El Alamein, but the last battle for Tobruk was over, setting the stage for another battle, one that would finally turn the war in North Africa. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was actually in Washington, D.C. at the time of Tobruk's capitulation, meeting with President Roosevelt and General George C. Marshall on how the war should be waged. An American aide gave word of the defeat to President Roosevelt, who then passed on to Churchill. Churchill's reaction was, quote, "I did not attempt to hide from the president the shock I had received. It was a bitter moment. Defeat is one thing, disgrace is another. Nothing could exceed the sympathy and chivalry of my two friends. There were no reproaches. Not an unkind word was spoken. What can we do to help?" said Roosevelt. I replied at once, "Give us as many Sherman tanks as you can spare and send them to the Middle East as quickly as possible." The capitulation of Tobruk would go on to be the second biggest capitulation for the British Army in World War II, with the fall of Singapore being the worst. 32,200 soldiers would become prisoners of war. Most of them would end up in Italy. They were shamed for the surrender of Tobruk being, quote, "too easy," unquote. German casualties were relatively light, with a total of 3,360 from the start of Operation Venezia on May 26th to the fall of Tobruk on June 21st, 1942. Germany understood how important and symbolic the siege of Tobruk in 1941 was, and greatly upplayed the significance of its easy capitulation in 1942. Erwin Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal on June 22nd, making him the youngest in the German army. He was proud of this honor, but wrote to his wife that he would have rather received another division instead of a promotion. With the supplies he captured at Tobruk, he was now in a position to advance into Egypt once again, where Rommel would come against another famous general from World War II. The battle that lies ahead we'll cover in another episode. As far as the map itself, I like Tobruk. I like the weather changing effects. Sometimes, when sandstorms hit right in the middle of intense gunfights, I think that's pretty awesome. Anywho, I'd like to thank you all for joining me on another episode of Historical Hell Let Loose. I apologize, it's taken a very long time for me to get out the second episode. As I stated in the opener, life got a little crazy, but for the good. I'm looking forward to busting out more of these episodes. The next one's obviously kind of a giveaway, even though I said it in the episode prior. The next episode will be on El Alamein. I'm really looking forward to that one. Anyways, if you enjoyed the content, feel free to give me a like or a subscription. If not, it's all good. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll catch you in the next episode of Historical Hell Let Loose. I'm BMAT15, signing off. We'll catch you guys next time.